Alright guys, so as you might recall in my last video, I had mentioned that the next video preceding that video was going to be on my top 5 search baits. And when I first hear about search baits, I immediately think, my mind goes to pre-fishing, because in tournaments obviously I don't want to go searching for fish. And there's a lot of baits that I could use on a national level, you know, a handful of baits that would be really good, that could catch fish all over the country. But I wanted to keep this video a little bit more regionally concerned, the things that I specifically use and have had success with. And I personally think that sticking to your confidence baits and the baits that you grew up fishing and the baits you're good at fishing is more important than you know, bending and flexing to accommodate whatever the local tactic is. So just by that I mean that if I was going to fish a tournament, say on the East Coast, I would still try to employ most of my West Coast tactics, regardless of location, just because it's a little bit harder to go wherever, you know, and fish not only a lake that you're not familiar with, but a tactic you're not familiar with. So here's my about top five search baits that I use out here, and I would probably use most other places as well. Sizes and colors are obviously always up for debate, and they'd likely change given location, but I set out a couple different examples of each bait here. So I'm going to start out in my first, my favorite search bait, and this is going to catch a lot of you guys by surprise, is a really big swim bait. 8-inch Huddleston I have out, a 9-inch Osprey, and then I'm going to talk about this other one in a minute. But the reason I picked these big swim baits specifically for this video, search baits, like I said, my mind goes to pre-fishing. These baits are going to show you the big fish. Not only do they catch big fish, you see big fish. They're big, they're bright, they move a lot of water, they stand out. A 2 and 3 pounder is going to follow these things just like a 10 or 12 pounder might follow these things. So that was the 9-inch Osprey. I catch a ton of fish on the 6 and 7-inch Ospreys, but I picked the bigger one just for the sole purpose of a search bait. I want to use these baits to find the biggest fish that I can find, whether it's a tournament scenario or I'm just looking for big fish in general. I could double back and maybe catch them later. But there's no doubt about it, swim baits are going to show you the biggest fish in the system, groups of fish, you know, however the scenario sets up. I almost always have a big swim bait on my deck, especially when I'm pre-fishing. So the bait I didn't mention in the last minute or so is this. This is a Hiroshima Customs glide bait. And the reason that this is my #1 search bait, swim bait, is because glide baits, for those of you that haven't thrown the glides, they pull fish like nothing you would ever believe. They move a lot of water, they have a lot of action, they go left to right, you know, anywhere 1 to 3 feet. A big bait like a depth, you might get a little bit more of a deviation from track. But these glide baits, these bigger swim bait glide baits, they're going to get more follows than any other swim bait you've ever used. I pretty much guarantee it. They catch big fish also. I've caught a lot of big fish on this bait. I don't know if the camera will pick it up, but there's just, I mean, there's teeth marks all over the head of this thing. And I've been throwing this for a couple years now, and it's just, they become one of my favorite swim baits. I'm a deliberate fisherman. Almost everything that I fish somehow is oriented to my beginnings as jig fishing, which is very, you know, I like to pick the spots that I catch big fish off of. I like to observe the fish before I catch them and really get into tune with the specifics. And that's where glide baits really came into play for me. I don't throw a lot of the multi-jointed hard bait, the big swim baits, you know, because they'll swim in, swim out. I like a glide bait. It's got a lot of hang time, left to right action. You can impart your own action and elicit strikes that way also. But this by far is my #1 search bait in this whole list of top 5. If I'm going out to pre-fish, to find fish, to look for big fish, this is the bait that I'm going to throw a lot of the time. And then I'm going to you know, adapt accordingly to find baits that I can catch fish on more consistently, because these glide baits, they get bit, but in a scenario where maybe I'm looking for a kicker in a trophy, not a trophy hunting environment, in a tournament or something like that, I like to find them with a swim bait and catch them on something else. Search baits are going to show you more fish than any of these baits, especially when you're not necessarily looking to catch them. They all catch them, but trophy hunting and tournament fishing are two totally different things, different mindsets, etc. If you use the swim bait as a tool, it can be a huge advantage over just throwing these little baits, because those are going to show you more fish and bigger fish. So next up, and not really any specific order, it all depends on conditions. As you guys know, bass fishing is just adapting to the conditions and matching your presentation to whatever is going to be the most positive scenario to catch fish. So we're going to go over to these next. These are deep crankbaits. These are baits that I've been throwing for probably 6 months. I like DD22s and things like that, but these are the Megabass 6 deeps. Originally I got this bait. This was the first one I got, and as you can see, it's been used quite a bit. It's got a lot of teeth marks on it. I actually won a tournament on this bait last fall, deep cranking. I really like deep cranking. And the reason that I picked these baits is just because standard deep cranking, I think this one gives me a little bit of an edge. It's got a very heavy tungsten weight transfer system. I can bomb this thing a lot farther than most other deep cranks. And another thing I like is the steep dive angle. You can see, well, maybe you can't see, but that weight transfer system inside there goes very far to the head. That's going to steepen the dive angle of this bait. And it doesn't have a true rattle system. You can hear it rattling, but what happens is that weight transfer system is actually what initiates a lot of the one knocker type rattle this bait has. It's going to dive steep to depth, and then once it stabilizes is when it locks into place and it, you know, shakes back and forth. So got a couple different colors out for this demonstration. Colors are all about matching the conditions and so forth. But the second one on the list was deep crankbaits. Next up, we're going to talk about rip baits. I have some shallow rip baits out and deep rip baits. I think it's really hard for me to just pick five baits for any given thing because there's so many variables that can come into play. This is a Lucky Craft Flash Pointer 115. There's a lot of teeth marks on it. Like, I'm trying to make emphasis on any bait that I show you guys in these videos. They're all baits that I caught fish on and had success with. I don't like representing things that I haven't personally backed, caught a lot of fish on. I think it's a more legitimate way to present my tactics and things like that. This is all the real deal. And there's no sponsor behind all this paying me to say certain things. This is the real deal. Here's another Flash Pointer 115 in a different color. That one's caught just as many fish as the other one. As far as deeper rip baits go, Vision 110+1 is a really hard bait to duplicate or out catch. Like I was explaining in my last video, in colder water throw a Stacy, but for general purposes I like the 110+1, especially in clear water. The action has a really good left to right dart. If you watch the Vision series underwater, they actually arc up, roll, and then start to dive. If you actually watch a Vision series on video. So these are really good baits. Like I mentioned earlier, it's hard to specifically say what bait is going to have an edge over another. There's so many variables in bass fishing. This whole video is just my general presumptions. I go out and I think the fish are going to be deep. That's the deep crank I pick. I think the fish are going to be on a rip bait bite, shallow on flats or something. I'll pick the Flash Pointer 115. If I think they're going to be on transition zones, maybe they're staging up, clear water in the spring, I'll pick that 110+1 by Megabass. And then I had to pick some kind of blade bait just because there's so many scenarios where you need to pick a blade bait, and a hard bait couldn't necessarily duplicate the results. This is a Phoenix vibrating jig. My decision making was between a spinnerbait and a vibrating jig. I think that a spinnerbait can be emulated a little bit better with the hard bait than a vibrating jig really can. The only similar bait maybe is a square bill, but these things are so unique I had to put it on the list. It's got a Kitech Easy Shiner 4-inch on the back of it, and you know, just shallow fishing around grass, fishing around brush, things like that. The chatterbait is something you guys should have in your arsenal. It's a good bait at night also, and it's a good search bait. It catches a lot of fish, and you can throw it in a lot of places where you can't throw other things, so that made the list. Honorable mention here, the Spin Bait 80. The reason I put this bait on the list is because this bait catches fish. If you're out pre-fishing and the bite's tough and you don't necessarily need to know where the fish are, but maybe what they'll eat or specifically what they're holding on, this is the bait to do it. You cast it out there, reel it in, and if you can't pull a fish on this bait, I mean, those are tough conditions. They really are. I haven't personally found a condition where they won't hit this, especially, you know, as long as the water's warm enough and clear enough. This is the bait I like to throw. I don't go down the bank searching for fish. Once I find consolidations of fish, I want to make sure they're going to bite. I use this bait. If you check a spot, I mean, just almost like you would use a fish finder, you can use this thing because it's so good at catching fish. So that made the list also. And then lastly, I had to throw in some kind of top water. I picked, this is a Head and One Knocker Spook. I picked that one because it was on top and it's got a lot of hook rash on it. It's caught a lot of fish also. Overall, the Head and Spooks are excellent baits. I like the newer ones just because they have obviously split rings and more range of motion for the treble hooks. You don't lose as many fish. The one knocker, I can't say with any scientific clarity why they're better than the originals. Maybe they're not. I like the one knocker. I like the size also. I throw a lot of big baits, but I think it's important to mix it in with smaller baits, you know, especially in tournament scenarios. The bait I was thinking about putting in that one knocker Spooks place was actually a Gunfish 135. It's a big bait. You're going to get follows on it. You're going to get a lot of fish that hit it, and so forth. And it's going to pull big bites. But anyways, these are the top 5 search baits in general. It's swim baits, some kind of deep crankbait, medium to deep crankbait, jerk baits, a vibrating jig. You know, the spin bait's a good one to have. Not necessarily for searching, but for catching, which in essence is very similar. You know, if you need to check a spot and make sure they're there when the fish are consolidated on, you know, more finite spots and things like that. I think that's about it. Oh, and then a topwater. Obviously, I had to base my selection on general types of fishing: upper water column, middle water column, and the bottom. As far as search baits, I wanted baits that were moving, obviously, and stuff that I could turn and burn and go find some fish with. So I'm interested to see what these other guys who are doing this series did. I think there's a couple of us, me, Kevin Bullington, and maybe 1 or 2 other guys, interested to see how our tactics differentiate or if they're very similar, the mindset and theories behind those as well. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. This is just a look into my world, my preference of baits and things like that. So stay tuned for next week's video. I'm not sure on the topic yet, but be sure to give me comments, give me ideas. I'd be glad to elaborate things for you guys.